Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Post-lunch? Awake? Coffee? Caffeinated? Okay. Good. Thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor to be here today, and I agree with Sean. He's really built up. Anne and I were saying the pressure just kept building and building. The morning was fantastic. Everyone gave great presentations, so we will try our best to keep that trend going. Today I'm going to present a paper that I'm working on with two co-authors. Bridget Brew is a graduate student in sociology and policy at Cornell, and Laura Tack is a professor in the policy department at Cornell, but also a sociologist. So in contrast to this morning's work, my work's going to be a little bit more sociological and a little less policy focused, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about maybe some policy implications of the work, but it's not particularly about any one given policy. So it's a rich demographic portrait of predictors in local context of school choice. Okay. So school choice, as everyone I'm sure in this room knows, I'm not going to spend very much time on this, has increased considerably in the last 20 years. In particular, in the 2000s, there was fairly large increases in especially public school choice. And when I say public school choice, I'm referring both to charter schools as well as magnet schools. A lot of the attention, I'd say in the media as well in political circles, has been about charter schools, but magnet school enrollments have also been increasing, and there's been a fairly consistent support for magnet schools from the federal government over this period, especially as it relates to efforts for integration, racial integration in schools. And at the same time, private school enrollments have remained stable among especially more advantaged populations over this period. Some recent work that Dick Murnane and Sean have done really nicely show that private school enrollments over time by SES, and showing that especially in urban areas, a lot of private school students are economically advantaged. Okay. And a great deal of research has investigated how school choice affects individual outcomes. And I would say the vast majority of interest in school choice has been whether or not it improves outcomes for individual students who enroll in choice schools. Usually, I don't know if it's completely because of this, but I think one attractive feature is that they're often oversubscribed, giving us opportunities for causal inference about the effects of school context. So I'll call this sort of the school effects literature. But we also, in sociology in particular, have been interested in how individual parents decide to use school choice. So there's sort of qualitative research that dovetails with quantitative research that investigates, so how do parents think about their set of choices? How do advantaged parents who live in urban areas use school choice as a mechanism to opt out of traditional public schools? As well as how do disadvantaged populations use school choice to expand opportunities? Okay. So often studies of school choice are motivated by concerns about educational equality and opportunity. And I would say here there's sort of an individual and a system level perspective on this. As I just said, I think there's a lot of concern about individual students and whether attending charter schools or magnet schools or private schools can increase academic achievement for individual students, right? And that's sort of that school effects literature. And the concern over equity is whether there's unequal access to these potentially better schools, right? So we are concerned that race and class play a role in access to school choice because of differential financial resources, time, information, social networks, all these kinds of things. But there's also concern on a more system level about the effects of school choice when we think about who's being removed from the traditional public school system, and if we think those people and those families have more resources, right, then it's leaving those students who are in the traditional public school system potentially with fewer resources in their schools that families bring to schools. This is a harder thing to estimate the effect of. And then sort of a correlated concern is that if we remove a subset of students from the public school system, then we get some mismatches, right? We get more segregated schools. There's been some work showing that choice schools in particular are more segregated than traditional public schools, and so we then worry again about the racial composition and the socioeconomic composition of schools and whether we're helping students to segregate by creating these choice options that are not equally accessible. But in our drive to understand the effects of school choice for individuals and sort of what the effects of these big changes in the education system are having on individual students, I'm going to argue that we've neglected to some degree to ask why the system itself is changing. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about a little bit today, thinking about what role community level factors or sort of local context plays in the uptake of school choice. So we're going to take a place-based approach to try to understand the locally variable uptake of school choice. And I'm going to consider that a combination of both supply and demand. And I'm not going to try to parse those things because obviously you can only get into a choice school if there are choice options. So part of that is going to be driven by parent demand for it, but part of it is controlled also by policies and regulations about charter school openings, magnet schools, and these kinds of things, less so with private schools. But I'm not going to try to disentangle those. I'm going to call sort of enrollment in school choice a combination of supply and demand. Okay? And what we're interested in is trying to understand the associations, the community level factors that shape differentiation in choice enrollment. So why is it that we have higher choice enrollments in some districts than others? And we don't think about this very often. We sort of think, okay, we're going to take a charter school in a city, and we're going to think about what the effects are for that student, for those students who enroll there. And what we're really interested in is, how do communities change the system, right? How do we decide that we're going to increase the demand for opting out of the traditional public school system, and how does that work? In particular, I'm going to focus on residential inequality, and this is really based in the literature. I would say a small set of studies have taken this sort of system-level approach where they've tried to understand what it is about local communities that sort of give people opportunities to opt out or create the demand to opt out. Some of this is nested in desegregation literature. I would say a brand of this research has tried to figure out the effects of desegregation, right, on white enrollments in public schools. So when desegregation happened, a big concern was that white families would leave schools. And so there's been, a series of papers trying to show what the effects of desegregation policies have been on white flight from traditional public schools. And then there's a few papers that have also tried to look at the consequences for segregation and inequality on charter school enrollments for white and black students, though that research is from basically the 1990s and earlier. Okay, so in particular, I'm interested in how it is that inequality in residential settings, which of course translates into inequality in school settings, because most students still attend locally zoned schools, incentivizes certain people, certain families to opt out of the system. What I'm interested in particular is thinking about the distribution of opt-out options. So not just private schooling, I'm going to include private schooling, but now I'm interested also in these public school choices, which has really changed the calculus because in the past it's really been about advantaged families opting out of the public school system. And now we have a set of options, a really complicated set of options that sort of spans low cost or no cost in the sense of the public school system to potentially very high cost for private schools. Okay. So the research question that we're going to ask today is, what is the relationship between intra and interdistrict inequality and enrollment in choice schools? So two factors within districts that we're interested in are racial segregation and income inequality. Racial segregation has been fairly well studied in this literature, in that small group of papers that look at this. The idea being, of course, that in racially segregated places, we'd think that it limits opportunities for disadvantaged students, right? They might be confined to racially segregated schools. For more advantaged populations, often people have thought that racial segregation might actually reduce their desire to opt out if it creates homogeneous environments. But at the high school level, I'm not so sure that's true. And we're going to study high school students because really racial segregation is often a micro phenomenon that doesn't sort of hold when you get to the high school level, that draws from much broader neighborhoods. Income inequality has been less studied in this literature, but again, in this era of rising income inequality, I think it's important that we start to understand how economic differentials might be affecting people's perceptions of the public schools and who their children might be attending school with. But of course, parents are not constrained to the district they live in, and so I'm going to also think about inter-district factors that might draw people out of the traditional public school system and into choice schools. In particular, we measure relative poverty of a district, in which we just basically take the difference of the focal urban district and the surrounding metropolitan area, and there's just a poverty difference, so it's the percent difference in poverty rates between the urban center and the suburban areas, which gives you sort of a holistic measure of the wealth of the urban district compared to its suburbs, as well as a political fragmentation measure. And I'm not going to say too much about this except to say that it measures basically the proliferation of other options, other districts that would be sort of within commuting distance. The idea there being that the more choices people have, the more likely they might be to actually leave the district instead of opting into school choice within the district. We're then going to ask whether the relationships differ by school choice sector and by student race ethnicity. So we're going to disaggregate the results and see if the processes, these processes of neighborhood inequality, differentially explain enrollments in magnet, charter, and private schools, which really serve very different functions. They're all very different kinds of of school choice. And then to understand if the processes are different by the share of students within race ethnicity. Again, to see if we can sort of start to tease out some of the implications of this differential sorting by race ethnicity. Okay, let me say a little bit about the data. We're going to use all urban districts in the US with minimum population thresholds. We start with a population of about 750 urban districts using the NCS definition of urbanicity. And then we pare that down a little bit just to sort of eliminate, there's some odd, very small urban districts. And so we set a minimum population threshold of 250 high school students, which is still very small. But we didn't want this to be a study of just the big urban places that you might think of. We wanted it to really be about all cities. And then we set a minimum population threshold of 20 students per subgroup. So they have to have at least 20 Black, white, and Hispanic students in the district as well. We've played around with different thresholds, and actually it doesn't really make much of a difference, but just to say we get to about 571 districts after those limitations. We do a repeated cross-sectional analysis using 2 time points, 1990 and 2000 and 2010-11. I can say more about why we choose to do a repeated cross-sectional analysis, but the basic idea is that these big institutional factors don't really change very much over time. So things like racial segregation within a district doesn't change all that much in 10 years. And so our theory is not really about change on change. It's not really about looking at within district change, but really to understand if the relationship between inequality and school choice has changed over time among all our districts. Our outcome is going to be the share of high school students enrolled in choice districts. And we're going to include state fixed effects to take care of some of the policy differences across states in terms of limitations on how many charter school seats, for instance, would be available. Okay, so let me just say another quick few things about how we construct our district-level school choice enrollment shares by race ethnicity. So we combine a few different data sources to do this. We use the Common Core of data to get counts of school in all public schools, so traditional public schools, magnets, and charters. And that we have data by race and grade, so we confine it to high school students. And we have the counts we want. We then incorporate the private school survey, which is also an NCS data source, which provides race counts for students enrolled in private schools, and we geocode those to districts because private schools aren't actually in districts, so we geocode those to incorporate them into all of our districts. And then we use the civil rights data collection to augment the magnet school data. So I'm just going to say a little bit about that. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. It's been a real thorn in this project, is that we discovered that the magnet data is really pretty bad in the CCC data. And in fact, there's some enormous states that are missing data altogether. Like in some years, Texas and New Jersey and Arizona don't have any data. In conversation with NCS, they confirmed that there was a lot of missing data and that some of it was legitimate. Some states in some years did not have any magnet schools, but most of it was just states didn't reply. So we got a tip from them that the civil rights data collection at the Office of Civil Rights also collects magnet school data. And so we actually ended up getting data from there, merging it with the CCD data. So they don't have counts of students and things like that. We merge it with the CCD data. And then we have all the other school characteristics. And we basically then take a combination of magnet schools from the CCD and OCR to get our magnet school data. And I can talk more about all of that if people are interested later. And then our community factors come from census and ACS data in school district boundaries. Okay, so very basically, this is sort of just descriptively what's happened with changes in enrollments by race ethnicity in our sample of urban districts over this 11-year period. And so in the first bars here, gray is private, blue is magnet, and pink is charter. And so basically what you can see is there's been sort of an uptick. It was about 17% of all students in 2000 were enrolled in one of these choice sectors, and that went up to about 22% in 2011. You can see that there was a slight decrease in private school enrollments and an increase in magnet and charter enrollments. If you break that out by race, you see that there's actually been an increase in private school enrollments, a small increase among white students, as well as an increase in magnet and charter enrollments. And for Black and Hispanic students, there's been a decrease in private school enrollments and a slightly larger increase in charter and magnet enrollments. So the story here is really that There's been an increase in magnet and charter enrollments basically for all students across the spectrum. Private school enrollments have continued to increase somewhat in the sample for white students and have declined for Black and Hispanic students. So let me just explain. Let me explain. We've got a lot of outcomes, and I'm going to try to condense that and make some sense of it. So we run separate regressions for each of our enrollment shares, right? So we basically have total, and then we have it by sector, and then we have it by race. So what I'm going to show you first is a summary of results for all students. So this is the total student population. This is all choice combined, and then we disaggregate that to see if we can sort of disentangle a little what's going on with the total choice, and we have that by year. So what I've done is I've simply just put a plus sign for the sign of a significant effect, and if there's no sign there, then we had no significant effect. And the story here is really that for private school enrollments, almost all sources of social inequality that I talk to tend to increase private school enrollments. So racial segregation, income inequality, and metropolitan fragmentation, which was not what we expected in terms of the interdistrict features, increase private school enrollments in that focal district. Okay. In terms of charter and charter school enrollments, we only see really that income inequality positively predicts charter enrollment. And in fact, I tried to bold this, it didn't really come up. When we pool them and run interaction models to see if those differences are statistically significant over time, this is actually the only significant difference, is that we see that increasingly income inequality is predicting enrollments in charter schools. Okay, and just to say that we're also here controlling for total population, median household income, foreign-born population, non-white population share, and percent Republican vote in the county. They have state fixed effects, and we're missing data in Tennessee and Idaho because there was no race data in the CCD for those states in 1999. Okay, so overall we see that social inequality is a robust predictor of private school enrollment, and that only income inequality is a predictor of charter school enrollments. I'm not going to go through all of the results by race because there's a lot of them, but I want to say just one sort of striking difference. So here's the results for whites. And what you can see is that basically all sources of inequality predict enrollment in private schools among white students, and that basically is driving the results we saw in the total students in the last slide. Actually, none of the inequality measures that we have for neighborhoods predict white enrollment in public schools of choice, and so something else is going on there, but it doesn't have to do with inequality in the focal district. Conversely, Black students, we see almost a completely opposite association. We actually see that none of these factors predict private school enrollments among Black students, and that charter school effect is being completely driven by Black students. Okay, so the take home here is that inequality seems to be driving opt-out behavior, both for sort of more advantaged and less advantaged populations, but that they're opting out into different sectors. Okay, so we're increasingly having these sort of silo effects where something about social inequality is making people dissatisfied with the traditional public school system, but for more disadvantaged students, they may be seeking out equalizing options, which might come in the form of public school choice. Whereas for more advantaged populations, we might see that inequality is driving them out of the public school system, potentially because it signals either that they'll have to go to diverse public schools, or that it might signal uncertainty, right? You know that there's sort of a lot of inequality in your district, and you're not quite sure what you're going to get when you go to those schools. And it's important to note that this is about high schools, which are, I think, a lot less controllable in some ways than elementary schools, right? Elementary schools are much more narrowly local, and so a lot of trends show that private school enrollments go up in high school because people feel, that they basically expand the neighborhoods from which they draw. Okay, so it's important to note that the results, might show something different if we looked at elementary schools. Hispanic students sort of fall somewhere in between, actually. They sort of split the difference, and we see, again, some more social inequality that's predicting private school enrollments that we didn't see among Black students, but also we see a charter school effect. So one interesting thing that I really didn't expect is that we actually see exactly the same results for magnet school enrollments across all race ethnicities, and that none of these factors predict magnet school enrollments. And so we've been trying to think through that a lot. Magnet schools we did not think was going to be a big part of this project, and yet it's come up as something that's been really interesting to us, in part after we've augmented the data. I mean, actually a fairly large share of students attend magnet schools in this country. In 2011, our estimate is 9%. That's from from compiling both the CCD and the OCR data. And so it's sort of interesting that it's off, I think it's sort of off the radar of researchers. You don't see a lot of research on magnet schools. I think in part, again, they're not, they often sometimes have requirements to get in, which makes it hard then to estimate the effects, right? Because we have sort of a selection effect. And so I think then sometimes people sort of back off and say, well, I don't really know what's going on with magnet schools because there's a selection, and they're selective schools, they have themes, there's a lot of things going on with them. And yet they're selective and they're, people are opting out of the public school system, and I think we need to understand more about how magnet schools are playing a role, especially because the federal government has been promoting them. Okay, so you might be asking, okay, we've talked a lot about community factors, and I've taken sort of a structural approach, but what about the schools themselves, right? Maybe there's something about the public schools themselves that are also affecting choice enrollments. So luckily, there's some data now on achievement scores in every district in the country. You guys might have heard of it. And so in these models, I'm not going to show you effects, but basically what we do is we run all the same models and we just include a holistic measure of achievement. So we use the CETA data to merge with our school choice data set. And we just use one measure per district as a combination of math and ELA, grades 3 through 8. So it's just sort of one score to sort of say, what's going on in the district holistically with achievement. I'm going to be very careful to say that I'm not going to call it a school quality measure, but I do think that when we think about how do parents decide about where to enroll their kids in school, this public achievement data is important for sort of the perception of how the schools are doing. And so in that sense, I'm going to sort of think this is a proxy for how parents might see the quality of the public schools, even though certainly it's confounded with, all of the things that we know in terms of the students that are already attending those. Okay, so when we include the CETA data, we actually do get a significant negative effect on private school enrollment. So this is, of course, net of racial segregation, income inequality, all of our other covariates. And we do see a significant negative effect of district achievement. So as district achievement goes up, private school enrollments go down. This is entirely driven by white students. It's white students who enroll less in private schools in higher achieving districts, which is what you would potentially hypothesize. And interestingly, it actually mediates to some extent the racial segregation finding. So the coefficient is reduced in the models with the achievement data. And so, it suggests maybe it's cross-sectional. We can only do it for 2011. So this is very much guesswork. But we might, some of that relationship between racial segregation and people opting out into private schools might be sort of tempered when districts are higher achieving. Okay, so to wrap up, this was a comprehensive, rich description of enrollments in 3 types of school choice. And we've tried to show you that the way in which we think about school choice is not only about how it affects sort of the outcomes, but not to think that it just comes out of nowhere, right? That there's variation across place in how people are offered school choice and how people take up school choice. And at a very basic level, it shows that people are dissatisfied in some way with the public school system. But what we've tried to show here is that the way in which different populations sort into choice is creating different silos outside of the traditional public school system. I think there's 2 competing views of school choice inequality. One is that it creates opportunities for more disadvantaged students, and I think the other is that it creates spaces for people to be protected from public school systems. And our results here show that some of the same neighborhood conditions are driving different populations into different sort of segregated school environments. Okay, thanks very much for your time.